Hello, and welcome to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast with your hosts, Russell Martin and Brent Aiken. This podcast is all about equipping, encouraging, and inspiring youth pastors weekly with topics that are brought to the table by youth pastors from all over the world. And now, here's your host for this week, Brent Aiken. Hey, and welcome to the podcast. If this is your first time listening to us, we want to welcome you and invite you over to our website, studentministryconversations.org, where you can find all of our previous episodes, show notes, blog articles, and much more. Our goal is that you're inspired, encouraged, and the things that you hear on this podcast can equip you to be a better student pastor for the church that you're serving or volunteering in. Today, we are sitting down with one of my good friends, Melissa Stevenson. And so she is a fellow youth pastor that works in town with me, but I'm going to stop there and I'm going to let her talk. Melissa, tell us a little bit about you.
Alrighty, so I've been in ministry 11, 12 years, youth for 7 now. So I've done the children's, I've done the family, and now I'm doing the youth, which is where I feel like my people are. I'm not a grown-up adult. That's the thing. I'm more of a middle school adult, just in a grown-up person. And so we do, my husband's a band director, so he teaches high school, so we go together quite well with that. Girl Scout leader, Boy Scouts, all of that fun stuff, 2 kids. So a lot of community stuff.
Yeah, awesome. And so I love the conversation that we're going to have today because I think it's something really, really important. But the topic today is having patience with non-church students. And so what do you exactly mean by that?
Okay, so one of our biggest goals as youth group leaders in general is to get more kids into the group, right? That's one of the things that our pastors put down upon us, get those numbers up, get those numbers up. And part of that is good because that's the goal is to get them into church, get them to, know Jesus and have salvation. So you can't do that with kids that have been in the church their entire lives without adding in new kids. You've got to have the ones that, especially in this day and age, we're missing a whole generation of parents, by the way. There is a whole generation of people that are just not going to church. So their kids haven't been going to church.
Sure.
So if we're expecting them to then come to youth to learn about God, and then we're expecting them to know how to church. And it's not something that is common knowledge. I mean, it's not the things you don't learn about in school. But part of it is not things they just know automatically. So you have to teach them, but you have to have the patience to get there. And because if we don't, they don't behave, and then we send them back into the world. What is that doing? Nothing, right?
Yeah. I love how you said that they don't know how to church.
Right.
And so in your words, what does it mean to church? I know where you're going with this, but I want to make sure that we all are on the same page as far as what we're actually expecting these students to do, especially with no background.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, a lot of they've seen church on TV and movies. It's usually not portrayed very well. But I mean, just the normal sitting still and being quiet and listening and not being on your phones and not taking a nap and not. And these are all the things that they generally do in school. I mean, I know on my side of the highway, we've got a new rule about no phones in school. I don't know about your side of the highway.
Not yet.
Okay, so they put out this new rule about no phones in school, you can have them in the hallway and everything, but they haven't been enforcing it. They still get their phones out underneath their desk. And so that's normal. When you go to a movie theater, you're expected to sit quietly and watch the movie. But we all get our phones out. I got a notification. I got to check what that is. And so that's just normal behavior in the world that they are growing up in. But it's not traditionally normal behavior in church. And so my kids are a lot of, we're inner city, and none of their parents go to service. We're totally a band ministry. And so I go get them every week. I text them and say, hey, do you want to come to church? And they all text back if they want to ride. And it is literally up to them. So it's their choice that they're making to come to church. No one is forcing them to come. And so that means I am their adult that sits with them in the balcony so people can't see us. And we, that's where we sit. And because when we were sitting downstairs and they would not know how to behave, how to be quiet, how to pay attention, that's the big one, how to pay attention, we were just getting these looks like, why can't you do this? Why don't you know this already? And so it's almost like we have to train them. We wouldn't send people out on the football field to play with the Yankees. Let's go back with that one. We wouldn't send them out on the baseball field to play with the Yankees when they've been playing Little League, because they wouldn't know all the rules. Lots of are super similar to school setting and listening to people, but they're just slightly different. So that's what I mean by how to put.
Yeah. And so I think that this is something that brings up an interesting conversation, though, because the thing is depending on the church that you're in, this wildly looks different. Especially, I mean, even the difference between, we're both from Methodist churches. And so my Methodist church would be considered probably a lot less structured, a lot less structured and organized than yours. And so what might look like churching in yours is not in mine at all. Exactly. And so it is one of those things. How do you find the rules that are worth teaching and worth getting them to like find the value and find the importance of? And then how do you, what's the measuring stick on like the rules that you really, really want them to follow? And then the rules that you're just like, oh, well, yeah, we do this, but this is really not one of those things. Like a lot of people, especially when it gets to church, especially as we get in farther along with our different culture and ages and everything else, as the church keeps progressing, one of the things that I've seen over and over is dress code. Dress code 20 years ago was completely different than it is now. And so is that one of those things that is a argument that is like, all right, well, we do this, you need to like, is that something you enforce? Where's the guideline on what is worth teaching them to follow and what's not teaching them to follow?
Well, that's one of those things. You got to pick your battles, right? And you're talking about dress code. My dress code in the sanctuary of downstairs is totally different. It's probably the same as 20 years ago than it is upstairs in the balcony. We're wearing our jammies up there. Because honestly, to me, that's not going to hinder you being able to hear about Jesus. Like that's like, if that's going to be the thing that keeps you home is you don't have a nice dress, sorry, that's not on the plate for me. But the big thing is the expectations. And so you're going to have to, look at your sanctuary, look at your congregation, look at your, the way the not the bulletin, but like the flow of service, like where everything is. And think about, do we want them to be able to do this or do we not want them to do this? And what are the things that you get the most phone calls about, et cetera, et cetera. And you have to write them down and you have to, that's why I kind of gave you a look about which ones do you follow and which ones do you don't. That's the problem. You have to follow the ones that you have written down, because otherwise, why should I follow any of them? And because that's the expectations and the boundaries. So we give them what we need them to do, and then here is the space that you have to do it. And that really it lessens anxiety, because if I know I'm only allowed to do these certain things within this certain space, I don't have to worry about the rest of out there or the things I could do, because that's a world of possibilities, right? That's a giant world. But if I know I can do these things, or I'm expected to do these things in this time, then, the rest of my day can be totally different. But that's a whole parenting thing right there, right? Expectations and boundaries.
Yep.
It's the same. You're parenting these kids in the church of how to church, which then spills over onto their, school activities and their, how they interact with other people. All of that goes together.
Yeah, no. And so I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second. So why is it important though? I mean, I feel like some people would argue like this is our church, our rules kind of arguments, and they just need to get along with the program and everything else. But like the whole topic today is patience with these kids. And so what is the potential damage of not extending grace to students that don't know Jesus when it comes to their attitude and interactions, not even at church specifically, but in youth, on events, activities that y'all go to. Maybe they hop along for a service project that's across town, and you talk about like being a good representation of our church and our and Jesus and everything like that. Like, what is the impact and what is the importance of doing that? And how do we avoid the damages that can be there?
Well, there's that big one of their brains are not developed. The frontal cortex that, controls impulses in general are not developed. Have you listened to Download Youth Ministry? Oh, you had him on here, the neuroscience guy. He's got the big beard. I can't think of his name.
Marco.
Yes, I think maybe.
Yeah.
But he has a lesson specifically on why that is, that maybe God had a reason for that of, that's how youth, when they go on mission trips, they don't have that scary, I don't want to go talk to that stranger, because they just go do it, impulse control.
Sure.
And so that's the reason for that. And so I love that. But at the same time, it means that sometimes they can't control their actions in church, which means that we need to redirect them, right? Not just stop, do that, but like, what can you do better? But also have that patience, because the phrase that gets sent to me is, well, we just need to send them home and then they'll learn to act better. From who? From where?
Right.
If they weren't acting that way when they got here, they're not learning about it at home. So they got to learn it here. Like, we are their learning experience for better manners. That's a big one.
Send them home so they'll learn about Jesus at home, and then they can be better. Like, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. That whole mentality of like, they're not following the rules, so they just don't need to be here. And it's like, what part of the gospel is that?
Yes.
And so, and I guess that's my other side of this question is, how do you combat, maybe for lack of better terminology, the negative Nancys that are in your church, that are the ones and are the voices saying, hey, look, like, they don't need to be here because they can't do what we're doing.
Yeah, the stories I could tell you that would break confidentiality right now. Just, but I mean, you have to break Jesus out of your pocket and be like, if that was what Jesus did to us, none of us would be here, right? That's the whole point.
Yeah.
And, and then I kind of make them look at themselves a little bit and go, okay, so you haven't screwed up at any point in your life. No big screw ups, no little screw ups. You didn't yell at that person in traffic the other day. I mean, that's what I want to say. It's like the passive aggressive kind of thing. But that's the one I really do bring out, and I've said this to my entire congregation, is in the United Methodist liturgy, in the hymnal, when a young person gets baptized and joins the church. Have y'all done that lately?
We don't do much liturgy anymore.
Okay.
So
well, we still use ours, even though it won't be for a while. We still use ours, and it literally says, do you as a congregation agree to take care of this child, to raise them up, to teach them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure.
And that's my answer to that. Like, you agreed to do this.
Right.
As a congregation, it is now your job. The one I actually had in my newsletter this month was Isaiah 42:16, which is where we get Waymaker, which I don't really understand. But I will lead them along I will lead the blind along a path. I will take them places they have not known. That's what youth ministry is them on this journey that they don't know about.
Exactly. No, 100%. And I think that's super important for multiple reasons, because the thing is also on top of that, I had a conversation with and I hate to use the stigma that it's just older generations, because it's not. Mm-hmm. And so, but I was talking to a gentleman the other day at an event that I was at, and he said that he was like, my heart is hurting because all these young people don't go to Sunday school anymore. So they just need to go to Sunday school, and then they can start learning about how to act and how to like be a part of the church and stuff like that. I was like, what part of the Great Commission is that? I missed it. Like,
well, and then you have to go, well, the history of Sunday school, it was there to teach people to read, because the book they had was the Bible. Like, that's where it came from. And we have that in schools now. We don't need Sunday school to teach people to read. I think the small group is a whole better way to do that.
Without a doubt. But it came to this whole premise of like, what's what's the point in the Great Commission? It's go and tell people
Mhm.
about Jesus. It's not get them to come to you
Right.
and then tell
It's
them about
easier.
Jesus. It is
Mhm.
easier, but
Yeah.
it's something that we're readily combating in our churches today. And so when we talk about having patience with these kids, ultimately the biggest combatants that we're facing sometimes is our own congregation.
Mhm.
And so are there any practices that you have done in the past that make this work more effectively than not?
My big thing is that we have our expectations written down, and it's in our. It's not a covenant; it's a contract. It's an agreement that it's usually the one they fill out with their van permission slip and their COVID permission slip and their photography one, all that fun stuff. But it's in there, and it is very much written down so they can read it and see it and sign it. And then I also sign it. But then you have to talk about them a lot. Like you
Yeah.
can't just do that one time when they first join youth, and then 6 years later you're like, why don't you know these rules? I haven't talked to them about them for 5 years. I don't know. And so you
Yeah.
have to keep going over them. We've also got big posters that have the rules, so we can be like, hey, look at that over there. But it's the big thing is just not giving up. Is that patience thing that's so big. Is and you have to think about when you were a kid, and how was church for you? Like if you grew
Yeah.
up in a church, when we sit in the back, we were on the very back row, and my mother was in the choir, and her friend was next to her, and their kids were next to me, and she would do sign language at us to stop us from talking.
I have
And
a deaf son. I sign language all the time.
see, right? And so, we would get those looks from the choir. And so I know that the people that are griping about this the most, they did the same thing. And
Yeah.
sometimes they have to be reminded of that they are not, grown adults in smaller bodies. They're still learning how to be a person.
Yeah. Well, and it almost falls to the nature of, and I've seen this too, where, and gosh, this could be a whole nother podcast by itself, but the mentality of like, I've already done my part. And so
Yes.
now this
Ooh,
is
big
just
one.
supposed to work out. And
Mhm.
like, that's not how it works either. Like Jesus didn't
Yeah,
Jesus said it is finished one time. And that was, other than that, like Paul came and he was like, there's still work to be done. Like Jesus did the
exactly.
work, but he was like, now the process begins of like trying to teach people what to do, how to live and everything. And that's part of our job, part of our life.
Mhm.
But it's not just us, it's everybody.
Yeah.
Like we are all called by the Great Commission to go out and make disciples,
Mhm.
teaching them the ways that we've been instructed.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's really, really important. And so how do we go about casting this vision and mindset, not only to our students and volunteers, because I think that's a huge, important first
Mhm.
step when it
Oh,
comes
yeah.
to Wednesday nights or Sunday nights, whenever you meet, or small groups. But then what about casting vision to the whole church as well? That can be two different questions that you attack.
Right. Oh, thank you. Um, the biggest one I see there is that list of expectations, those rules. Everybody has to know them. I had a couple of volunteers this last year, and they were getting on to people for things that are not in our rules because I don't really care. And I had to be like, whoa, 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 like slow down, because you can't get after them if they don't know that they're not supposed to do that, right? That's not fair. And so I had to, oh, wait, you don't actually know our rules. Like, here is the paper. See, these are the things that we should be watching for. And then when new kids come, I do have a little spiel that I do for them that said, okay, no cussing, no kissing, no fighting, no drugs, no vaping. And I say it's a lot like school, except I get to talk about God. Like that's the rules there. And sometimes they need to know, like even the ones that have been here for 3 years, they need to know those 5 things. And sometimes they can label them back at me. Um, but I do think it's important that if we all know the things that we are okay with and the things that we are not okay with, and maybe that needs to be a bigger conversation as far as like your admin council, your executive board, et cetera, then that should make a better conversation, but also a better environment for kids,
Sure.
because that's the most frustrating is when they get in trouble for things they didn't know they couldn't do or they shouldn't do. And that's the easiest way for a kid to be like, I'm out of here. I'm going to go home. I'm not coming back here. I'm done.
Yeah.
And so that's the biggest thing, is just those, knowing what your rules are and what is okay and what's not okay. Before service, especially if we have new kids up in the balcony, I say, okay, we're standing for the first 2 songs. Put your devices down. We are standing for the affirmation of faith. After that, I need you to not talk. I don't care if you're on your phones, and I don't care if you take a nap. We're standing for the other 2 songs, no devices, and then that's the end of service. And it's one of those, I've picked my battles, and I do not expect them to sit quiet for an hour and a half without doing anything. They're just not made for that. And so
I'm not made for that.
Exactly, right? Yeah. And well, and this is a big problem with that, as far as our attention spans in general of life. But that could be a whole podcast right there.
Yep.
And so, but finding those rules that you're not okay with, ones you are okay with, and that's going to vary on congregations, right?
Yeah. And so as far as the patience aspect of like, how does that go when they don't follow procedure or follow rules? How does that patience come into play?
Oh, are you talking about, or when it doesn't come into play and there's,
well, I mean, if that's the main topic of this conversation, like, right. What is, patience with non-church students, what, like, how does that patience come into play? Like, is there a process of like, hey, like, we're going to go step outside and we're going to talk about this kind of thing like that? Or, do you have
there are consequences in those expectations. There are consequences that if this first thing happens, then, verbal warning. The second one, we're going to go have a conversation in the hallway. And the third one, and it's usually one of our big 3 of alcohol, drugs, or violence, that those are an automatic call to home and you have to leave. And so there are certain things that you do have to put that, pull that out of your pocket, that you are not welcome here right now. And I think that's the big part right there, right now, because of your actions. And I do actually have written in there that means that they're not welcome to youth on Sunday nights. I will never bar them from coming to Sunday service, but I won't pick them up in the van. Like if they're on their have to go home time, which could be like 3 Sundays, then their parents can bring them and their parent has to stay with them, but I won't pick them up in the van, but I will never close the doors of sanctuary to them. That's not my job. That's God's job, I guess.
So as far as this goes, obviously setting rules and setting examples and policies and all of that, as far as like just clearly explaining the rules and expectations. And a lot of times I believe this has come up in a couple podcasts now of, when you set expectations for students, they'll rise to them 90% of the time. And so they might not want to at first, but the thing is they will, because students like to be challenged. They like to be given that extra responsibility of discipline or whatever it may be. And a lot of times they don't see it as a burden. Some of them will still have immature moments and they'll mess up, but who doesn't? And so what about casting to the entire church? Is there anything different, or do you just still kind of say, hey, like, this is our expectations, we're going to sit up in the balcony, kind of leave us alone, kind of thing like that? How does that work?
No, that's literally it. Well, and it's not that we don't want to be a silo, but at the same time, it caused me and them and the congregation gigantic amount of anxiety. We tried to sit in the front row for Advent, and there was no hearing a sermon for me. I was constantly going, stop it. And we also couldn't be on our phones up there because everyone could see us. We couldn't take a nap. There's been a long-standing rule in our children's and youth program that if someone falls asleep in church, that's okay, because that means they know they're safe, and maybe they're not safe at home to sleep. So that's why napping is fine with me, and maybe they're getting some osmosis happening. But they couldn't, like, even just the regular messing around that youth does in church, whacking each other. Everyone was watching us. And so we moved upstairs just so we can have that freedom and the congregation has that freedom, just so they can pay attention, because that's the biggest part of why we need to behave in church, is because we're distracting other people, right?
Sure.
And so so yes, but if that's not an option for you, then we got to figure out some different solutions. And so maybe those solutions are that your rule is that you have to sit still, or maybe we sit in the back, or and maybe you talk to your congregation and be like, okay, here's how the youth are supposed to act in church, and here are the reasons why. These are the things that we're going to do. Like if we're going to let them be on their phones, we're going to say we're for the Bible app, or maybe they need to
Yeah.
text mom. But we're not going to let them watch YouTube. We're not going to let them be on TikTok, things like that have audio and are distracting.
Sure.
Netflix. And so maybe by both of us, the youth and the congregation, which I hate to separate because we should be all one body, but by having those two separations and everyone knows that this is what we're going to do, it should alleviate it.
Yeah.
You might have visitors, you might have people that haven't been to that conversation, you still might get phone calls, but at least you have a plan. And especially if you've had this conversation with your pastor about here's the plan and he's on board with it, then send those phone calls to him.
Yeah. And I think that's a pretty important process in just about anything you do in youth ministry. Make sure your pastor's on board.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say that enough, over and over and over and over and over and over again. Make sure your pastor's on board. And some people listening to this podcast are probably like in a situation that I've been in the past, where it's like, well, my pastor really does not care, or he does not like me.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a very, very realistic problem. And so you find ways to handle it, but you also lean on other leaders within the church to set those expectations and those plans. Maybe you have a family in the church that's been there for a while that has students that are in youth. Maybe you have an associate pastor, or maybe you and the children's pastor are the ones that are working together to make this happen. Whatever, you need to find someone and say, hey, look, this is the set expectations that I have. And that needs to be something concrete. And as far as the relationship process goes, are there any downsides or things to avoid that you've caught along the way that can hinder relationships in the way that this is done? I mean, obviously, kids don't like getting corrected all the time. And so have you ever gone to have you ever caught anything like in your process of having this I guess rules and system established to where it has had a negative effect on a relationship that you could have built?
As in, did they leave and not come back because of
Yeah, like, I mean, is there basically like, are there downsides or things to avoid that you've noticed along the way that maybe like you tried this with a student and a student really just did not gel with it? Or maybe you've made adjustments over time because you've had different things happen that you're like, oh yeah, that was probably not the best route to go, because I've done that 100 times.
Oh yeah, no. I'm actually thinking the biggest one we had this summer. Man, I was going to call her to see if I could share the story, but it was a big problem, like on a mission trip, almost tried to put her on a bus to send her back home, that kind of thing. And so I had a meeting with her mom and I said, here's the consequence for this action that we all know about, because mom was called while we were there. And I said, she can't go any overnights or out of Abilene trips. Like I can't trust her right now. I can't take her on the mission trip next year. She cannot go to camp next year, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any of the out of Abilene things that we do. And I really thought that would be, because she's a freshman, just now in high school. And I thought that would be the straw of the camel, like she'd be done. And she's been in the church since she was like 3. And she's still coming. Like every once in a while I have to get on to her about something and she's like, oh yeah, like, yeah, I'm gonna do better at that. And then this week, she texted me asking for some food for lunch. It's one of the things I really like to do. And so I took some Subway to her and I was like, how is school going? And she's like, I've been on time to all my classes. And so it's almost like you said, where they want to rise to that expectation, but at the same time, sometimes they are just craving the attention and the the boundaries, and to say, for someone to say, I really care about your actions, and this was not a good idea, and you need to do better because you can.
Sure.
And so I think that really worked out for us. It totally could have gone the other way. Like, I actually thought it was going to go the other way.
Yeah.
But she came back.
Well, and I think addressing it with grace is the important part of
Mhm.
when I mean, obviously those conversations are going to happen. And I guarantee you someone listening to this is like, oh yeah, like I've definitely had that. Me personally,
Mhm.
I've had that exact conversation on a mission trip. We almost made a kid go home, and we were 2 states away at the time. And
Yeah.
it was just one of those things. It was like, this is going to be a nightmare logistically if we have to figure this out. But it was one of those things. It's like, look, this is your moment where grace is extended.
Mhm.
Like, you have this shot. You will not have another one.
Yeah.
I
Well,
expect better here. You know, our expectations,
mhm.
and a lot of youth groups even have like trip meetings or pre-trip
Mhm.
expectations, or we do a mission trip devotional booklet, and I have like expectations of their actions on the mission trip, and they have to sign it, all kinds of stuff. And so they have the expectations there. But when those are broken, I think that's where the patience and the grace really has to come
Mhm.
in, of saying, you're not messed up, you're not broken, but you did make a mistake. And
Yes.
this is going to be something that has ramifications. But your grace moment is here. Like, this is it.
And having grace and having that patience does not make you weaker as a leader. Like, that's a big thing we see lots of school teachers. My husband's one. But if I give in to them, they're gonna walk all over me. That whole thing. And that's not always true, especially
Yeah,
not true in church. Like,
sure.
that's not a worry that I have.
Yeah. And so as we're kind of wrapping this up and rolling to the end of our episode, for pastors or youth pastors, children's pastors that might see this as part of their ministry that is a weakness, or maybe this is just something that, like, someone's listening to this now and they're like, man, like, if I brought unchurched kids into my Sunday morning service, I'm pretty sure I'd lose my job.
Right.
And this is granted, this is definitely kind of geared towards the more traditional churches. So I would assume that this is definitely more in that side of the realm than the upbeat, hip, non-denominationals and all those that
Oh
are
yeah.
out and about, because they tend to have a few different rules and different understandings of how to do things. But what would you recommend that they start with?
Start with how to bring unchurched kids in.
Yeah, like how
Okay.
to present that to the congregation, how to cast that vision to their
Mhm.
leaders and their students that are in the group already, and just say, hey, this is something that, like, we really need to combat better.
Mhm.
And I've noticed that our church is really not doing a great job at this, and this needs to change. Like, how do you make that first step? What would you recommend
Well,
as
I'll say,
far
and
as their action plans?
that is a big problem when you start to do that. Is, well, the churches, especially the traditional churches, their demographics are aging so much, and with not having new people come in, you're going to close your doors. And so my biggest thing on that is, why have you been tithing to this institution your entire life if your expectation that is will be closed when you die? What was the point of all of that? And so, because I would want a legacy to live on, right? With all of that money that you could have been doing other things with. And so if you get those unchurched kids in, and that's a bigger thing, is that they don't tithe. So you have to wait till they're older to grow your congregation. So it does take some time, but if you get those unchurched kids in, your church will be there longer. But you also have that, and ours is on Sunday night. So you have the Sunday night kids and you have the church kids. And if their parents come to church and they've grown up in the church, they're over on this side. And then you've got the other half of them over here. And sometimes, especially the parents of the church kids, they don't want those unchurched kids in there because they're going to be bad influences on my little precious darling. My kids are church kids. They've gone to church since before they were born. And so every once in a while, I worry about that with my 13-year-old who's now in the youth group, of the friends he's making, But at the same time, there's no way I can shelter him from the world. Like,
Yeah.
so at least I can be there while he's seeing it. And so he can, I can pay attention to what's happening. And so our unchurched kids came because in the children's department 10 years ago, they decided to go into the neighborhood. And they started picking up all these kids in all our vans and bringing them to the church. And they made one little mistake in my view. I was not here yet. And they didn't get their parents to come, because I think that would have helped a whole lot more to get those parents to come. And so it's something now we're kind of working on, because now that they're all in high school and middle school, is just, we only have the kids, we don't have the families. So that's something to work on. But it's just, you have to be open to it. You have to have your doors open. You can't be the church in the middle of this neighborhood that this is the only people we're going to talk to, is the people inside this building. You have to be able to go and talk to all the people. Now you're on a golf course, so like, go talk to the golfers, I guess. Like,
yeah, definitely.
Your
It's
neighborhood's
scenic
a little
for sure.
different than mine.
It is very much. I mean, but at the same time, like, I think one of the very common things to throw out is like, I have just as many unchurched, if not more unchurched people than you do. And it's one of those things, is like the like, especially now in the culture that we live in, church does not have a demographic.
Oh, absolutely.
And so with that, like, you need to be aware of the culture and the community that you're in. You need to be aware of the surroundings of your church. And the thing is if you're not doing a good job ministering to your church community, the people around that live around your building, then you're not being effective. And honestly, you should branch out after that. And like you said, the vans is a great idea. But the thing is like you said, this needs to be something that you talk through. This is something that you begin the process of building people that have a heart for what this will bring. And you have to have that established first. You need to also have your leadership on board. I don't think I don't know if I'm going to say that. I was going to say, I don't think that any pastor would say, no, we don't want the people that are in our community in our church, but there might be a few, and that breaks my heart. But it is one of those things at the same time, like, you have to find the people with the heart for it. You have to find the people that are willing to invest and put in the time, because it's going to bring chaos. And absolutely. You have to have effective chaos coordinators to make that happen. And so very, very.
That's what I'm going to put on a shirt. Youth ministry, effective chaos coordinators.
There you go. That's pretty much it. So, but anything else on this topic that you'd want to throw out there? Maybe something that we missed, or?
I'm going to say the other the two things. They're going to keep doing stupid things over and over and over again. And so the patience level has to stay up here, and we only get them, I get them for 3 hours a week. How about you?
Yeah. I mean, if that.
And so you got to versus how many do they get at school, and versus how much do they get home? How much do they get on the internet? Like, the time that we get them to change some of these behaviors is only 3 hours. So it's going to take a long time. It
takes the family too, like exactly. You said.
Yeah. One of the things I tell when I get interns in for the summer is that change is possible. It is not immediate. Like, this is not going to be there. You totally could come in for your 3 months of the summer and change someone's life. But if you didn't, that's not a failure. Like, you still did a lot of good work today, that kind of thing. Yeah. And so it's the patience is not just with the kids. You have to have patience with yourself. That this is not an immediate fix.
Sure. No, definitely. And so finally, how can people connect with you on social media? Shameless plug, email, whatever. How can people connect with you if they want to reach out to you and maybe talk more on this subject?
Okay. So Facebook, Melissa Stephenson. Is this going to air this year or after January?
No, it'll be in a couple weeks.
Okay, then we're at fumcabilene.com. That's going to change in January. That's why I had to ask.
Yeah, no,
and my information's on there too.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely, obviously something that is going around church circles. Not everybody knows about it, but the Methodist Church is going through a little bit of a small
split is the technical.
Yeah, split is the technical term, or
so
yeah, there's churches that are going different ways in the Methodist denomination, and so some will be going and staying United Methodist, some will not. And so but yeah, her connection is should be fine. You can go to First Methodist Abilene.
Abilene.com.
Yes. And then also find her on Facebook. Of course, all that will be in the show notes for this episode on our website. And yeah, Melissa, it has been a pleasure. I love that we got to have you on the show, but that is all that we have for this show. Did you know that you can now support us by being a Patreon member? You can go to patreon.com/talkstudentmen, and you can check out how to sponsor our show, as well as the different perks that come with being a subscriber. If you can't support us financially, that's totally fine. All we ask is that you do your part to get our podcast out to the greater student ministry audience. Share our podcast with your youth pastor friends on social media, or tag a specific episode that really stood out to you. Either way, be sure to tag us in the post on your favorite platform using @TalkStudentMen. And then finally, if you want to be on the show in the future, just like Melissa, reach out to us on social media or send us an email, podcast@studentministryconversations.org. And we'd love to set up a time that you can come on the show and have your voice join in on the conversation. Melissa, this has been so much fun. Of course, I know you very, very well because we meet regularly throughout the month and get to talk about all kinds of ministry things, but super excited that you got to be on the show and share wisdom with the many years that you've been doing ministry.
That's an old joke, y'all. That's an old joke.
It is not, but it's great conversation, a great topic. And honestly, this is going to be episode 77, 78. And this is not a topic that we've had at all. And so it is definitely something that is important to talk about, though. And it's something that needs to be an eye-opening kind of drive from our side of this. Is we got to remember that sometimes there are kids that are going to require a little bit of extra grace. And we are not doing them service. We're not doing ourselves service if we aren't working to extend that grace to them. Just like hopefully we would want that extended to us as well. But this conversation has been so much fun, such a great topic, and we're excited for the listeners to get to hear this. And we hope that you, the listener, have a great week, and we will see you next week.